About 2 months ago, a black teen named Carmelo Anthony, somewhere in Texas, I believe, was in a tent. I think it was either lacrosse or rugby, some sport was involved. That's a weak point of mine, but one of those. In a tent belonging to these two white twins. Their last name is Metcalf. I forget their first name. He was not supposed to be in the tent. Why he insisted on being in the tent has not been made clear yet. But the white boys asked him to leave, and he refused. And then they got closer to him and touched him, and he had a bag. And he said, "Touch me and see what happens." And so they kept touching him. Carmelo Anthony stabbed one of the boys, one of the twins, in the heart, and he died. He ran, and then he gave himself up, and he said that he did it because, quote unquote, he put his hands on me. Now, this is what I can't get past.
Yep.
A white boy wouldn't have done that. Now, that's a vast overstatement, but...
Yeah, how do you know that, John?
Yeah.
Because if there were a scene like that, and especially if you're people like us and you've always got your eyes peeled for things like this, the white boy would not kill the black twins. As in, if that ever happened, we'd hear about it because that white boy would be celebrated as evidence of racism, etc. It was partly something about Carmelo Anthony. It was partly that there's an element of some black culture that says that it's okay to go off, that you don't hold it in. Huh?
Let me offer a behavioral economics interpretation of that, right? So the argument that I make in the book is that, one of the big breakthroughs in behavioral economics over the last couple of decades is that our minds work in a way that is very different from how we think. So when we think about thinking, we think of the little voice in our head. That gives us the capacity to do rational things and invent the internet and whatever. It doesn't mean that it's always rational, but to the extent to which we can. And so in Danny Kahneman's amazing book, Thinking Fast and Slow, that I hope everybody reads because it's just such a profoundly important book. In that book, he refers to that as like slow thinking or system two thinking. And that's very, very powerful, but it's very mentally taxing. Just think about the last time you spent 15 minutes doing the crossword or the Wordle or something on the New York Times website. You're exhausted. You've got to go do something else. And because that sort of deliberate slow thinking is so mentally taxing, our minds have evolved to do a different type of thinking that we're not even aware of that happens below the level of consciousness, a series of automatic responses that are fast, effortless, and adaptive that is useful for usually useful for a bunch of routine things that we see over and over again in our daily lives. So Kahneman calls that thinking one or fast thinking, whatever you would want to call it. Now, here's why I think that's relevant, John, to the example that you gave. So, and I'm gonna tell you a little story, and you're gonna be like, "That's just a story," and then I'm gonna try and convince you that there's something to the story with some data behind it. So I'm not just BSing you.
Yeah.
So, I think one of the things that we know from a big body of research in sociology, from driving around talking to teachers and kids and cops and social workers and whatever in different neighborhoods, in under-resourced neighborhoods, the adults are overwhelmed. And just give you a very, very quick story about this. I was driving around with the commander in the Englewood neighborhood a few years ago. We're on 63rd Street, one of the big east-west, it's 2 lanes in each direction. Car in front of us is a Friday night. Car in front of us is swerving across all 4 lanes. I turned to the commander and I said, "I think that guy's drunk." And he said, "I do too." And I said, and he slams on the brakes and he puts a big distance between us and the other car. I said, "Aren't you going to do anything? You're not just the cops, you're the cop. You're the commander of Englewood." He's like, "Jens, if I stopped every drunk driver in Englewood, I would not have time to worry about the real problem in Englewood, one of the most violent neighborhoods in the city, which is gun violence." And I think that speaks to this idea that both formal and informal social control is easily overwhelmed in under-resourced neighborhoods. So now I'm a kid growing up in Englewood, and I'm walking to school, and this is going to be the behavioral economics theory of the phenomenon that you're describing, John, and then I'm going to try and convince you that there's data to prove it. So I'm walking to school and someone challenges me for my lunch money. In a neighborhood where formal and informal social control, like the adults are just overwhelmed. I can't turn to an adult for help. My system one, I argue, learns pretty quickly that if I hand over my lunch money today, I've just signaled to everybody else in the neighborhood that I'm an easy victim. You take my lunch money today. Tomorrow you're coming back for my jacket. The next day you're coming back for my phone. Like that's it. It's over for me. And so system one learns below the level of consciousness. When I'm challenged, that's a routine situation I see over and over again. I fight back. And notice the severity of the fight back need not be proportional to the provocation because it is not backward looking retribution to what you just did to me. It is forward looking signaling to everybody else in the neighborhood. And notice the important part of this is because it is system one fast thinking, all of these sort of stimulus response connections are developed below the level of consciousness. We're not even aware of this, right? We all have these sort of system one responses. We're not aware of this. And that leads to what from the outside can look like overreactions when those responses are overgeneralized, including when someone's got a gun, when someone's got a knife, like whatever it is. So that's my sort of theory. It's like, the key insight with behavioral economics is not just that people make mistakes, but that there's some predictable structure. Mm-hmm. Now, the reason that I would argue that that is not just a story, that there's really something to it, is the very first experiment. So, I'm an empirical economist. I believe in the power of data and science to promote social progress, like in the same way that the FDA requires any new medication to have a randomized controlled trial as evidence before you give it to a patient. I think we should be doing something similar in the public policy space. The very first experiment we did was a test of a program called Becoming a Man, run by a Chicago area nonprofit called Youth Guidance. And it's middle school, high school age, men, boys, I don't know what you would describe, teenagers on the south and west sides of Chicago. They bring them into a room. And like Glenn and I would be a pair, and they would give me a rubber ball. They'd say, this is the first exercise the kids do. It's called the fist exercise. They'd say, Glenn, you've got 30 seconds to get the ball out of Jens's hands. Go. And what does Glenn do? Most of the kids in Glenn's situation basically beat the crap out of his partner for 30 seconds. Glenn will try and pry my hand open, doesn't work, breaks my pinky, puts me in a headlock, starts punching me in the stomach. The BAM counselor calls time. We switch. I do the same to Glenn. Then we debrief. And the BAM counselor then will say, Glenn, what strategies did you try? Glenn said, I pried his hand open. It didn't work. He's stronger than he looks, blah, blah, blah. And the BAM counselor will say, Glenn, why didn't you ask him for the ball? So Youth Guidance has now done BAM with something like, I think the numbers are something like 10,000 kids in Chicago over the last decade. And they tell me that not more than like a dozen kids ever asked. So it's really quite striking. And the kids in Glenn's situation will say, oh, if I would have asked Jens for the ball, he would have thought I was and you can imagine what kids fill in there. And then the kicker is the BAM counselor will turn to me and say, Jens, what would you have done if Glenn asked you for the ball? And I said, I'd just give him the ball. It's just a stupid rubber ball. Who cares? Much better than having my pinky broken and put in a headlock and punched. And you can see, notice what that program is not doing. It's not ending poverty. It is not threatening people with stiffer punishments. What it is doing is it's engaging, and it's through show not tell. It is getting kids to be a little bit more skeptical of whatever system one, fast thinking, is putting into their heads. To get them to be a little bit more system two and deliberate in these sort of high stakes moments that lead to violence. So you're like, well, that surely can't work. We did a randomized experiment, just like they do in medicine. And we used police data to measure violent crime arrest rates for kids. So we're not relying on kids' self-reports so you worry that they're lying to you. We see a 50% reduction in violent crime arrests, also a reduction in arrests for weapons offenses.
That's comparing people who went through the program with those who did not.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you. Sorry. And then we redid it and we basically see the same thing again. Now, whether that would work if you give it to 1 million kids is an open question, but as proof of concept of what is driving the behavior, I don't see how you can look at that evidence and not be moved off of your original conventional wisdom position. Like you've just got to update in your thinking about what's going on, in my view.
But I must say, it's hard to believe that I could alter the landscape of a high crime area city with a lot of people with guns and a lot of homicide by this kind of an exercise. I mean, that's kind of asking a lot for me to believe that.
Yeah, let me try and this is one of the two sorts of approaches that I think we can try, but let me try and convince you, let's see if this is successful, that there's more scalability here than you might think.